Hey friends, what's up? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 7 of Moed Katan. Let me roll up my sleeves over here. Alright, sleeves rolled up. Well, today we're gonna, the first part we're just wrapping up kind of the Mishnah from yesterday, which is that you can, kill like rodents and stuff, and also we talk about fixing walls. Alright, friends. If from the first day of Daf Hayomi 2 years ago you were looking to hear about killing rodents and fixing walls, today's your day. And then we talk about saras, another gripping topic. Can you check a fellow out for leprosy on Chol Moed? What do you guys think? Friends, we're all the way at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Aleph, top line in the page of Yehuda Omer, Mistei Ilon Kedarko, Mistei Alovin Shelo Kedarko. You can trap these like rodents in a orchard in the normal way that you would trap rodents, and in a stealovin and in a what's it called, a grain field, shelo kedarko, not in its, you can trap it in abnormal way. Yeah, we were discussing today in a groove earlier, what's your favorite way of terminating a mosquito? Alright. Tana Rabbanan, the rabbis taught Ketzid kedarko. So what is a normal way to trap a rodent? Chofer gumos. So you dig a hole, betoleba mitzuda, and you put a trap in. Alright. Okay. Ketzid shelo kedarko. What's a way that is not the normal way to trap a rodent? No, it's shvud. If you take a skewer and you shtup it into the ground, umake bekordom, and you take a hammer and give it a knack, umirade adamo mitachtea, and you flatten the ground and it crushes the thing. That would be a not normal way to do it. Okay. Tanya, we learn in the Brayso. Reb Shimon ben Elazar Omer says, Reb Shimon ben Elazar Sha'amu misdei lavon shelo kedarko. When they say that in a like wheat field, you can kill these rodents in a not normal way, you could trap these rodents in a not normal way. Lo amru ella bisdei lavon asmucha la'ir. So that's talking about a wheat field that's close to a city. If you have a wheat field that's close to a city, you want to trap a rodent, so you have to do it in a not normal way. Avol, however, but if you have a wheat field that is close in proximity to a orchard, and there's a concern that the rodents might get into the orchard, so afilu kidarko, then even in the wheat field you can terminate the rodents, you could trap the rodents in the normal manner, you could dig the hole and stick in the trap. Shema yetsu miste'alovin v'achrivu esailanus, because we're concerned, we want to prevent a situation where these rodents exit the wheat field and enter the orchard. So if you have a fence and it breaks, it's breached, so then, right, Omed Muba ala Paritz, remember that sugya from Erevin? It has nothing to do with this, but that's where we talked about pirtzas over there also. Again, completely unrelated. But anyway, so you're allowed to fix a breach you could fix a breach in a fence on Chol Moed. And we said that if it's Shemitah, so then you can even just build it normally. Alright, fine. Now, Ketzad Mikarin. Tell me more about filling in this breach. Rav Yosef Rav Yosef says you're allowed to use hutza and dafna. Who can tell me what those things are? Palm fronds and laurel. What in the world is laurel? Well, you can't use it. B'masnisa tani, we learn in the Brayso, tsar b'tzor ve'enu toch batit. You can kind of put stones in there, but don't use like cement or anything. Okay. Amar Rav Chizda says, Rav Chizda, lo shanu ela kosel hagino. Now Rav Chizda says, this that we're talking about, that if there's a breach, you can fill it in. So that is talking about a wall of a garden. You have a garden, and there's a wall around it. If there's a breach, so then you're allowed to fill in the breach. And we say, you can use palm fronds and things like that, but don't just build a fence in its normal manner. So that's talking about for a garden. However, if we're talking about a fence, a wall around your chutzner, your courtyard, where if there's a breach, or if there's no fence at all, or if it falls down, so you have to be concerned about thieves breaking in. So then, Bona Kedarko, you can just build the wall regularly, do whatever you need to do on Chol Moed in order to prevent a situation where a thief can get into your courtyard. So let's say that the following supports Rav Chizda. Kosel hagochel l'reshus harabim. If you have a wall that's like leaning into the public domain, now what's next to the public domain? Your domain, your chatzer, right? So Kilo, you have your courtyard, and then outside of your courtyard is a public domain, and you have this wall that's kind of like unstable and is leaning into the public domain. You're allowed to destroy it and then rebuild it because of danger. Now, interestingly, the Gemara is kind of ignoring the mipnei sakana piece, right, out of danger piece, and basically it's focusing in on the fact that we seem to be saying that when it comes to fixing your wall for your chatzer, right, you have this wall that's kind of unsturdy, and it's by Rishus Harabim, i.e., the wall between your courtyard and Rishus Harabim, and it's unsturdy. So the Brisa is saying that you'd be allowed to knock down the wall and put it back up in order to protect your chatzer. But now the Gemara points out, one second, the point of knocking it down and putting it back up is not to protect your courtyard and your property. It says explicitly that the reason why you can destroy it and put it back up is because leaving it there poses a risk to the public, because it could fall down and somebody can get hurt. So that is why you're allowed to break it down and put it back together. It's not necessarily to prevent thieves from getting into your courtyard, and therefore it's not necessarily a proof for Rav Chizda. And those who say it in the following way, Toshma, come in here, when you have a wall that is leaning into the public domain, that you can knock it down and rebuild it in order to prevent a catastrophe, in order to prevent somebody from getting hurt. We want to ask a question on Rav Chizda based on that the Brisa seems to be saying explicitly that how come you're allowed to knock down this wall and rebuild it in order to prevent somebody from getting hurt. However, if that was not the issue, if we didn't have to worry about anybody getting hurt, you wouldn't necessarily be able to build the wall simply to protect your property. So let's say that this is actually a question on Rav Chizda, because the Brisa seems to be indicating that the only reason you'd be allowed to build this wall is to prevent people in the public domain from getting hurt, but it doesn't say anything about protecting your courtyard. So Amalach Rav Chizda. So listen to this. Rav Chizda is going to respond and say, Hasum soser uvona. Yeah, over there, because you have to be concerned about somebody getting hurt, you can even take the additional step of dismantling, of breaking down the wall and then rebuilding it. But hacha bo nevelo soser. Over here, all I'm saying is that in order to protect your property from being broken into, you'd be allowed to construct a wall, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to destroy a wall and then rebuild it. When it comes to somebody who might be able to get hurt in the public domain, so you can even destroy it and rebuild it. All I'm saying, says Rav Chizda, is that forget about the destroying part. If you have a wall and it needs to be built around your property in order to prevent somebody from breaking in and causing you financial damage, so you'd be allowed to construct a wall on Chol Moed to prevent that situation. Hasam Nami, list of lo livnei. In fact, the Gemara, one second. When it comes to the wall that's leading into Rishus Harabim, to the public domain, and somebody can get hurt. So we said that you can knock it down and then rebuild it. How come you have to rebuild it? If all we're concerned about is that somebody shouldn't get hurt, that it could fall down on somebody, so just knock it down, and then it won't fall down on anybody. And then it won't fall down on anybody. Why are you going to take the additional step on Chol Moed to rebuild it? So, if that's the case, mimna velo soser. Well, if you can't rebuild it, so then you might not destroy it in the first place, and we want you to knock it down so that nobody gets hurt. And Rav Ashi says that you can also infer this from our Mishnah. Like Rav Chizda, that's specifically a specifically a garden, you would not build the wall normally, but in your courtyard you would be allowed to. The Katani, as the Mishnah says, Uvashvi is bona kedarko, that on Shemitah you can even construct the wall in its normal manner. Now, where am I? Now, when the Mishnah says that during Shemitah you could construct it in its normal manner, are we talking about constructing a wall around a garden? Are we talking about constructing a wall around your courtyard? So if you think that it's talking about the courtyard, do you have to even tell me that during Shemitah you're allowed to build a wall around the courtyard? Friends, right now it's Shemitah this year. Why can't I build a wall around my courtyard? We have a courtyard outside. What? I can't build a wall around it? What does that have to do with Shemitah? So it must be that it's talking about a garden. That what it's saying is that in Shemitah you're allowed to build a wall around the garden. And the chiddush there is that even though it's a garden where you're growing fruits, and you might think that or where normally you would grow fruits, and you might think that you're putting up the wall around the garden in order to protect fruits, and that could be a problem. So Shmamina, nonetheless, we're saying that you're allowed to put up a wall around that garden during Shemitah, and that's no problem. And what we're saying in that same Mishnah is that if it would be Chol Moed, so then you would only be allowed to kind of fix these breaches with these, kind of palm fronds and things like that. But you wouldn't be able to build it normally, and that is talking also about a garden. However, like Rav Chizda says, the implication being, like Rav Chizda says, that if we're talking about your courtyard, where you have to be concerned about protecting your property, so then you would even be allowed to, it would be a different story. You would even be allowed to construct the wall in the regular fashion. All right, that was interesting stuff. Friends, now we get to a new Mishnah. And this Mishnah talks about Saras. Friends, what do you know about Saras? Why are my keys over here? Wait, seriously. Why? Oh, I know why my keys are over here. Does that mean that the door is unlocked? Quick, before the people come. Friends, I'll be right back. Speaking about people getting into your property, I forgot to lock the door. Ho ho. Wow, the door was mamish open. I mean, not wide open, it was closed, but it wasn't locked. Reb Dennis, if you were visiting the Yanina Shul, you could have just strolled right into my hideout. Says the Mishnah. Reb Meir Omer, says Reb Meir, Roin es hanigoyim lehokol, avelo lehachmir. Says Reb Meir, that on Chol Moed, if you're a Kohen, and a fellow comes to you and says, hey, Mr. Kohen, I might have tzaras. It reminds me of like COVID-19, quarantines, isolation, do you definitely have COVID? Do you maybe have COVID-19? So says Rameir, Roin es hanegoyim lehokol avol lehachmir. So a fellow comes and he says, look, I might have tzaras. And the Kohen's like, all right, let's take a look. And so what happens is, if he sees the affliction and he's like not sure if it's tzaras or not, so he says, hey, dude, why don't you chill out for a week, come back after a week, and let's take a look again. So if he takes a look again and then it's deemed a week later that it's tzaras, then he becomes a tzaras inflicted fellow, and he's got to go outside of all the camps and hang out there until it goes away. So, but if still after a week it's not clear if it's tzaras or not, so he waits for another week. And then he comes back after that week. And then at the end of that week, a decision needs to be made. Either, right, if nothing's kind of changed, so he just kind of goes home and it's fine. Or, if something sort of went south, so then he becomes a Mitzorah and he's got to leave all the 3 camps and stuff. So while he's kind of like in quarantine, so to speak, while he's like waiting to figure out, does he have tzaras or not, right? Maybe, what was it called? He had an exposure, kind of like a COVID-19 exposure. So, I mean, this is different. This is tzaras, but like Kilu, if you have an exposure, you just got to kind of like hang loose for like a while until we figure out if you have symptoms or not. So here Kilu, so the guy just kind of hangs out. I don't know, I feel like the fact that we have COVID-19 in our lives helps us understand Tumas Tzaras maybe a little bit. But anyways, so while he's like unsure what this like thing that he's seeing is, he kind of hangs out and waits around. And then, so that's what's called Mitzorah Musker, that, right? Hesker, that's talking about when he's kind of just like in quarantine. But then there's Mitzorah Muchlat, is when it's been decided like, yeah, you've had a positive a positive test or whatever it is, kilu, you have the thing. You have tsaras, and then that's what's called a Metzora Muchlat, a decided leper, and he's got to leave all of the camps and stuff. Okay, so back in the Mishnah, Reb Meir Omer says, Reb Meir Ron es hanagoyim lehakol avol lahachmir. So Reb Meir says, look, we could, the Kohen could check out, an affliction, tsaras, and he could tell the fellow, look, no, it's pure, it's no problem. But if it was a problem, he just wouldn't say anything, and apparently then he can just go home, and it doesn't become any better or worse. But you could do, so that's Reb Meir's opinion. On Chol HaMoed, the Kohen could say, look, you're pure, but if he was impure, he just wouldn't say anything. The Chacham say no. The Kohen doesn't check out any Nigoyim, any suspected Saras at all on Chol HaMoed, whether to be lenient, whether to be strict, just leave it alone. Says the Gemara Tanya, we learn in a Brayser of Meir. Omer says of Meir, Ro'enes hanagoyim lahakol avalo lahachmir. So the Kohen checks out the Tsaras, and he could say, look, it's pure, and be lenient on the guy, and you go home and enjoy the Yom Tif. But he wouldn't tell him that you are tameh, because that would sort of interfere with his ability to be happy on the festival. Rabbi Yossi Omer, whereas Rabbi Yossi says lo lahakol, lo lahachmir, that no, the Kohen doesn't look at the tsaras at all, not to be lenient, not to be strict. Shem ata nizkok lo lahakol, nizkok lo af lahachmir. Because ultimately, if we're saying that the Kohen could check out the affliction to be lenient, well, then he's also going to have to check it out to be stringent. Once he checks it out, he's got to give his opinion, and even if that means that the fellow has tsaras, well, so be it. That's what it is. But once already he's giving his opinion, so then he's got to just say what it is. If it's tar, it's tar. If it's tummy, it's tummy. But that's that. But alternatively, you could just, Rabbi Yossi is recommending just don't look at it at all. Don't look at it at all, and then it's just nothing. I guess no man's land until you figure out what it is. Rebbe says Rebbe Nirin divrei Reb Meir b'musgar v'divrei Reb Yossi b'muchlot. So Rebbe says that if we're talking about a Metzora Muskar, and the Gemara is going to explain in a minute what we're talking about Muskar, because we said that Metzora Muskar, when he's in quarantine, there's like different stages. There's the first week, there's the second week. But anyways, Rebbe says when it comes to this guy in quarantine, and we're looking, so this fellow's been in quarantine for, let's say, a week or 2 weeks, we'll see in a minute. So Rebbe says the halacha is like Reb Meir, that if the quarantine is up and it's time for another check, and it's Chol HaMoed, so then in that case it would be like Reb Meir that the Kohen would check out the tsaras, whereas v'divrei Reb Yossi b'muchlat, that it's like Reb Yossi that no, the Kohen would not check out the tsaras if we're talking about a fellow who's already been determined to be he has tsaras, kilu. It's been determined, it's been diagnosed. He definitely has tsaras. So now he's like in isolation, and he's outside of the camps and stuff. So, and he's got to hang out there. So we don't check him out, to see if maybe it went away or whatever, on Chol HaMoed. All right, fine. Rava says, now when it comes to the Metzora Musgar, right, that Rebbe said that when it comes to a quarantining, right, let's say quarantine versus isolation in COVID-19 terms, right? So quarantine would be, I don't really know the quarantine and isolation stuff in COVID-19 terms, because I haven't really geeked out on it so much, but I'm gonna, what I mean here is that quarantine is like a fellow who hasn't been decided yet that he's got tsaras, and isolation is a fellow who's definitely got tsaras, and now he's like isolated outside of the camps, outside of all three camps, right? Machne Shechina, Machne Levia, Machne Yisrael. So Rava says that when we're talking about quarantine fellow, so b'tahor kuli amalo plige de lo chazile. So if we're talking about a fellow who isn't yet even in quarantine, he doesn't yet even know if he needs to go into quarantine. For the first time, he wakes up on Chol HaMoed and he says, what in the world is this spot that I'm seeing on my skin? I sure hope it's not saras. Well, in that case, everyone agrees. Reb Meir and Reb Yossi both agree that he would not go to show it to the Kohen, because it can only get worse. Right now, he's tahor. He hasn't gone to the Kohen at all. He's not in quarantine. He's not in isolation. Nothing. So it can only go south. Either the Kohen says, no, it's nothing to worry about, and he remains tahor, Or he says, oh, you have to go in quarantine or something, or isolation, whatever it is. I mean, it can only get worse. It can only go downhill. So in that case, everyone agrees to lo chazile that he should not show it to the kohen. Behezger Rishon. What if already before the festival he showed it to the kohen? The kohen says you have to go into quarantine, and now it's a week later, and it's time for the kohen to check it again. So now it's Chol Moed, and it's the end of the first week of quarantine. The question is, does the kohen take another look at it on Chol Moed? So the Chuliyamalo Plige de Chazile, that everyone agrees that in that case you would send it, you would show it to the kohen, because also at the end of the first week of quarantine it can only get better, because right now he's in quarantine. But if he shows it to the kohen and it turns out to be tahor, so then great, he can go back and enjoy the rest of his Yom Tov. He's tahor. He gets back the negative result, nothing to worry about, and that is that. Now, the interesting question is, what if it ends up spreading, right? What if it's tameh? So then can it go get worse if it ends up being tameh? So, apparently Tosfos has that kasha, and the point is that, since there's up to 2 weeks of quarantine, the kohen doesn't have to give a verdict at the end of the first week of quarantine. So therefore, when the fellow comes after the first week and he says, hey, so what now? So the kohen, either if it got tahor, if it got pure, so he says, don't worry about it, you're pure, go home, enjoy the rest of Yom Tov, there's nothing to worry about. Now, if it took a turn south, the kohen after the first week does not have to give a verdict. He doesn't have to determine it as being tameh. He could say, just wait another week. So in that sense, it doesn't get any worse. It could get better if it's pure, and he doesn't have to stay in quarantine anymore. And if it's impure, the kohen just could say, wait another week. He doesn't have to give a verdict. And therefore, it's not going to get any worse. It can only get better by showing it to the kohen at the end of the first week. So again, if it's before, if he hasn't even started quarantine yet, and he sees a spot for the first time, so he doesn't go to the kohen, because right now he's tahor. Why risk making anything worse? If it's the end of the first week of quarantine, he can go to the kohen, because it can only get better. That the kohen could say, look, you're tahor, don't worry about it. And if it got any worse, he just won't say anything at all. You'll just remain in quarantine. Ki plige, where there's the machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi about, do you show it to the kohen on Chol Moed, or don't you show it to the kohen on Chol Moed, is Behezker Sheni, is at the end of the second week of quarantine, where a decision must be made. Marsaver b'choin talya milsa. So Reb Meir says, look, it's up to the kohen, right? Because Reb Meir had said that that the kohen could be mekil, just not machmir, right? And therefore, itor amalei tahor v'itom mishosik, right? It's entirely up to the kohen, and therefore the kohen can, if at the end of the second week of quarantine, the guy comes and he's tahor, so then mimele, the kohen will say, you're tahor, go home, enjoy the festival. Now, if he's tameh, Reb Meir's opinion is that he could just keep his mouth shut. He could just not say anything. And as long as he hasn't said anything, so then he's still, Reb Meir's opinion is that he could still just kind of keep his mouth shut and say nothing, and then he won't be officially tameh. So therefore Reb Meir says, look, you can, in this case, he can so Meir says at the end of the second week of quarantine, let him come to the kohen, and worst comes to worst, so the kohen will just keep his mouth shut, nothing will change, he'll remain in quarantine. Umar Savar, whereas Rabbi Yossi holds Letaro Letamo Ksiv, it says no, to make him, right, the Pasuk says, what does the Pasuk says? The Pasuk says, Zostoras Negatras, Begad Atzemo, Pishtim, Oshasir, Erb, Okokli, or Letaro Letamo, to make it Tamir, to make it Tar, that Kilu the kohen, once already the fellow comes before him, he's got to make a decision, either Tar or Tameh. And therefore, if the fellow is coming to him, to the kohen, he's got to make a verdict. Meaning, whereas when it came to the end of the first week of quarantine, Rabbi Yossi was willing to say, the kohen can keep his mouth shut, the kohen doesn't have to, say that it's tameh. But when it comes to the second, right, that's the first week of quarantine, but by the second week of quarantine, the kohen needs to make a decision. And therefore, whereas Reb Meir says, so there's a machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi. Reb Meir says that by the second week of quarantine, no, the kohen can still just kind of keep his mouth shut, and if it's tahor, so he says, look, it's tahor. and therefore go and enjoy the rest of Yom Tov. But if it's tummy, he'll just keep his mouth shut. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, he can't just keep his mouth shut. He has to make a decision. And therefore, if he's coming in front of us, right, on the second week of quarantine and saying, hey, what now? Did I get better? Did I get worse? Rabbi Yossi says, look, the Kohen's gonna have to say something. And if it's Torah, then great. But if it's Tameh, he's gonna have to make him Tameh. And therefore, Rabbi Yossi says, just don't come at all. And as long as you haven't come at all, then, nothing changes. That's machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi, specifically regarding the second week of quarantine. However, if it was before the quarantine even started, he was tahor, everyone agrees that he wouldn't show up to the Kohen at all. And if it was the end of the first week of quarantine, everybody agrees that you do go to the Kohen, because the Kohen could make him tahor, and if it's a problem, he could just say stay in quarantine. But at the end of the second week of quarantine, then it's machlokas. Reb Meir says, let him come. And if he's tahor, the Kohen will tell him he's tahor. Whereas Rabbi Yossi says, no, stay away, because if you're tamei, we're going to make you tamei. We don't want to make you tamei on Chol HaMoed. Omar Mai, we said earlier, Omar Rebbe, says Rebbe, Nirin div Rabbi Yossi b'muchlat v'div Rabbi Meir b'muzgar. Okay, so we said earlier that Rebbe says that it seems like Rabbi Yossi, when it comes to it seems like Rabbi Yossi when it comes to tamei muchlat, right? That when you have a fellow who is definitely tamei, right? He's had a positive test. He's in isolation right now. So it would be like Rabbi Yossi that you would not come to the Kohen on Chol HaMoed. V'div Reb Meir b'muzgar, and like Reb Meir by a mitzor, by muskar, by a fellow who's in quarantine. That if he's in quarantine, then you would show it to the Kohen on Chol HaMoed. Tanya Ipcha. But one second, we have a Brisa Ataka says the opposite. That when it comes to muskar in quarantine, it's like Rabbi Yossi that you would not show it. But if it was definitely, if it was in isolation, so then it would be like Reb Meir that you would show it. No, it would be like it's confusing. If you're in the other way to say is that if you're in quarantine, it's like Reb Yossi, and if you're in isolation, then it's like Reb Meir. Basically the opposite. Now Tanoi Aliba de Rebbe. So we say, well, it's true. It's two Tanoim explaining two different versions of what Rebbe's opinion is. Ma'asavet Tzavsa de Alma Odifle, Ma'asavet Tzavsa de Ishto Odifle. The question is, who would this fellow prefer to be in company with? Would this fellow prefer to have the company of his wife, or would this fellow prefer to have the company of the community? Because basically, it goes like this. When a fellow is in quarantine, so he doesn't have to leave the community yet. He only has to leave the community if he definitely has tzaras. So he could stay within the community. However, while he's in quarantine, he's not allowed to be with his wife. He's not allowed to sleep with his wife while he's in quarantine. Now, the opposite is true when he's in isolation. He's not allowed to be with the community. He has to leave outside. He has to, hang out outside the three camps. However, he is allowed to be with his wife during that time. So the question is, what do we assume a fellow's preference is? To have the company of his wife or have the company of his community? And therefore, according to the first way, that when it comes to a Mitzorah Muskar, so Mitzorah Muskar, he's in quarantine right now, which means that he has the community, but he doesn't have but he cannot be with his wife, right? And therefore, if we say that it is like Reb Meir, that you would show it to the Kohen, so what can happen there? So what can happen in that case is that if he ends up being tamei, so then he's got to go to isolation, in which case, while he doesn't have his community, he's still, right, he's able to be with his wife, right? And when it comes to a fellow who is in isolation, so then we would say that it's like Reb Yossi, that you would not show it to the Kohen, because while he's right now in isolation, he could be with his wife. Whereas if you show it to the Kohen and he ends up becoming tahor, so then once he's tahor, so then there's like a 7-day process where he no longer has to stay outside of the camp, but he's not allowed to be with his wife during that time. So again, when it comes to, so according to this way of understanding, a fellow would prefer to be with his wife, to have the company of his wife. And therefore, when it comes to Mitzorah Muskar, a fellow who's in quarantine, who right now is not allowed to be with his wife, so we would say that the halacha is like Reb Meir, because if you show it to the if you show it to the Kohen and he's tahor, so then he's tahor. I mean, that's best case scenario. And even if the Kohen ends up, if he ends up becoming tameh, right? So then he has to go into isolation, and in isolation he's allowed to be with his wife. So kilu, either way, that would be fine. Now, however, if you have a fellow who's already in isolation, and either he's going to stay in isolation where he could be with his wife, right? So, or if he becomes tahor, so then he's got to, have this additional week of he doesn't have to stay in isolation, but he's essentially goes back to quarantine status for a week. So then he's not allowed to be with his wife. So therefore, we would say by a fellow who's in isolation would be like Rabbi Yossi, that you would not show it to the Kohen, because right now he could be with his wife. And if the Kohen says he's tahor, then he won't be allowed to be with his wife, and therefore don't show it to the Kohen if he's in isolation. That is one way of saying it. The other way of saying is that he'd prefer to be in the company of his community. And therefore, according to that logic, so if he's in quarantine, so right now he has the company of his community. So therefore, it might not have the company of his wife, but he has the company of his community. And therefore, it would be like Rabbi Yossi, that you would not show it to the Kohen, because if he ends up becoming tames, then he's got to leave the community. But if he's in isolation, so that was if he's in quarantine, but if he's in isolation, so then it would be like Reb Meir, that you would show it to the Kohen, because if the Kohen says that he's tahor, so then he can come back into the community. And even though he won't be allowed to be with his wife, but he'll be able to be back with the community, so therefore you would show it to the Kohen on Chol Moed. So, okay, different ways of understanding. If it's like Reb Meir, like Reb Yossi, if it's in isolation or in quarantine. Alright, fine. Lemeima, affect the Gemara, is that to say the muchlot mutter b'tashmish shamita? Is that to say that a fellow who is definitely a tsaras fellow, he's allowed to be with his wife in, yes. V'atanya, as we learn in the Brisa, v'yashav mechutz le'ohalo shivas yomim, that once he is tahor, right, it says, right, v'chibes hamatayir, says the pasuk is begodav v'gilach es kol sayir v'rochos b'mayim v'tohir. Right, that it says that when you have a fellow who had saras and now he's tahor, so then he gets a haircut, he goes to the mikvah, all these things, and then he's got to stay outside of his tent for 7 days once he's tahor. That he's not allowed to be with his wife during that time. And his tent is his wife. Shenemar, as the pasuk says by Maimed Har Sinai, you could tell them now that Har Sinai is over, you can go back to your tents, i.e., you can go back and be with your wives. Rebuta Omer says that there's a pasuk in Yechezkel that says Shivas Yom Yispru Lo Yimei Sfiro V'lo Yimei Chaluto. That it says that while he is in, right, what does the pasuk say in Yechezkel? It says V'achri Ta'araso Shivas Yom Yispru Lo. That after he is tahor, he then needs to count for 7 days, and that means yimei sfiro velo yimei chiluto. That says Rav Yehuda that during the days of when he's counting, so during these Shivas Yom, during these days, Yisprilo, he's got to count, and that he's not allowed to be with his wife, but yimei sfiro velo yimei chaluto. That while he's counting these 7 days, that's when he's not allowed to be with his wife. But when he's in isolation, he is allowed to be with his wife. Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda Omer, whereas Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda disagrees and says, Shivas yimei sfiro kavachomer yimei chaluto. That, well, if he's not allowed to be with his wife after he's already tahor, well then, memele, says Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, he would not be allowed to be with his wife when he's in isolation. Okay, fine. So it's machlokas about can he be with his wife or can't he be with his wife when he's in isolation. From Reb Chia, and says Reb Chia, Danti lifnei Rebbe, that I said before Rebbe, Limantenu Rabbeinu, teach us, Yosam lo hayelo leuzio ele bimei chiluto, that Yosam was conceived to Uzio and his wife when he was a mitzora. Amilo afani kach amarti, and Rebbe says, yes, that's exactly what I said, right? So Rebbe agrees that while a fellow is definitely mitzora, he's allowed to be with his wife. What's the machlokas? Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda Savar, Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, who says that you're not allowed to be with your wife during when you're definitely a mitzora. Sover gali rachman b'mei sfira v'kolshken b'mei chaluta. As we said a minute ago, that the Torah says that you're not allowed to be with your wife, after you're tahor already, when you're counting. Certainly, then when you're tameh, you're not allowed to be with your wife. My sover, my de gali gali, my de lo gali. Whereas Rebbe holds that where the Torah says that you're not allowed to be with your wife, that's where you're not allowed to be with your wife. If it says that, right, that for 7 days, right, you have to he's got to stay out of his tent for 7 days. So for those 7 days, he stays out of his tent. That's it. The Torah didn't say anything else, and therefore, if it didn't say anything about when he's definitely a mitzvah, so then that implies that when he's definitely a mitzvah, he's allowed to be with his wife. So now, Fekti Gemara, we had said, both according to Reb Meir and according to Reb Yossi, that it's essentially dependent on whether or not the Kohen checks out the tzaras, right? Reb Meir had said that if the Kohen checks out the tzaras, he could say that it's tahor. Alternatively, if it's tameh, he could just keep his mouth shut, and then it's not tameh. Reb Yossi says, if you go to the Kohen, then if it's tahor, he has to say it's tahor. If it's tameh, he has to say it's tameh. However, but you don't have to go to the Kohen. As long as you don't go to the Kohen, well then, nothing's been decided. Which implies that ultimately, it's up to the Kohen. And if the Kohen doesn't make a verdict, whether it's because he keeps his mouth shut or because you didn't go to him in the first place, well then, it's not necessarily tzaras. It's up to the determination of the Kohen. So the Meimra, the Bekohen Tali Misal, does that imply that it's all up to the Kohen? It does. V'atani, as we learn in the Brisa, Uviyom Heiros Bo, that on the day that it is shown to the Kohen. What does the pasuk say? It says Uviyom Heiros Bo Basur Chayitma. That on the day that it is shown to the Kohen, raw flesh, live flesh, then it's tahor. Okay, fine. So Yesh Yom. Where am I? V'yom Rosbo, Yeshom Sha'ata Roebo, V'yeshom Sha'ata Roebo. So there are certain days that you show it to the Kohen, and there are certain days that you do not show it to the Kohen. Right? That there are certain days when you could just ignore it. You're allowed to just ignore it. You don't have to show it to the Kohen, implying that as long as you don't show it to the Kohen, then you're going to remain tahor. Mikan Amru, from here they said, Chosin, Shnolad Bonega, Nosin Lo Zayni Me'amishte Lo Uleveso Luchsuso. That what if you have a chosin, a groom, and he finds out that maybe that he's got something suspicious. So they say don't go to the Kohen to get it checked out for the first set, during the 7 days of the feast, for the 7 days following the chasana. For him, for his house, for his clothing, right? Leave it alone. Just don't go to the Kohen. Don't check it out until you're allowed to wait until after the 7 days of festivities. And similarly, on the festival, right? Give him the 7 days, right? If it's a festival, so you don't have to get it checked out on Chol Moed. Divrei Rebbe Yehuda. That is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion that we learn out from Uviyom Rose Bo, that there are certain days that you check it out, certain days you don't check it out. And if you don't check it out, so then Memele, you remain tahor. Rabbi Omer says, Rabbi Eino Tzarech, you don't have to learn out from that pasuk. Rather, Rabbi Omer, the pasuk says, V'tziva akoyin ufinu es aboyis, that when it comes to tzaras of the house, so it says in the pasuk that if you have suspicious stuff on the walls of the house, so the Kohen says, okay, before I come, just get everything out of the house, because until then, everything remains tahor. That the Kohen says, all right, before I come, and it runs the risk of it becoming tzaras, get everything out of the house while it's still tahor. And if we're going to wait for a dvar rishus, over there, there's no mitzvah. When it comes to a groom, when it comes to a festival, there's a mitzvah to be done. And we say in the context of a mitzvah, you can push off showing it to the Kohen. Over here, we say that even when there's no mitzvah per se, it's just you want to salvage everything in your house before, it turns out that maybe the house is tummy with tzaras. So if you're allowed to sort of delay the arrival or the verdict or the decision of the Kohen for when there's no mitzvah, context of mitzvah, kolshkin, the dvar mitzvah, then certainly by a groom, certainly by chol moed, right, by a festival, you'd be allowed to push it off as well. My benayu, what is the nafkamina between Rebbe and Rabbi Yehuda? Am Rabbi mashmaus dorshanika benayu. So it says Abai that there actually is no technical nafkamina. There is no difference. They both agree about the same halachis, just that Rebbe learns it out from this pasuk by tzaras of the house, and Rabbi Yehuda learns it out from the pasuk of uvyom heiros bo. V'Rava Amar Davar Rishusiki Benayu, whereas Rava says actually there is a real nafkamina, and that nafkamina is something that's not a mitzvah, right? So meaning something that is volitional, that is optional. So in Rabbi Yehuda's pasuk, we only learned about a chosin, for example, or if it's a festival, for example, if it's one of the shalosh regalim. So in that case, you can delay going to the Kohen. However, what if it's just a rishus, right? So if there is no specific reason why you're delaying it, so then you wouldn't be allowed to delay it according to Rabbi Yehuda. Whereas Rava says that according to Rebbe, we see from the pasuk that basically the Kohen says, look, before I arrive, go and get rid of everything from the house, i.e. that, you're allowed to delay the decision of the Kohen, for to give enough time, let's say, to clear out the house or whatever it is. Rabbi Yehuda, Me'asam lo gamrinon, and Rabbi Yehuda, so now we ask, how come Rabbi Yehuda didn't learn out from Rebbe's pasuk? How come Rebbe didn't learn out from Rabbi Yehuda? Right? Why does Rabbi Yehuda have to learn out from the pasuk of Yom Hirosbo? Why does Rebbe have to learn out from the pasuk of Vitziva Kohen Efinu Es Habayis? So Rabbi Yehuda Me'asam lo gamrinon, Rabbi Yehuda is unwilling to learn out from Rebbe's pasuk by the tzaras of the house because the chiddush. Because tzaras of the house is a chiddush. Because in general, of course, we know pshutei klei eitz are not makabel tumah. Stone, of course, is not makabel tumah, right? Didn't we say at the beginning of Masechta Yoma that what did we say, by the para aduma or by the kohen gadol? What did we say? There was these vessels made out of tumah, out of stone. Said nothing should be makabel tumah. So in general, wood, pshutei klei eitz, and stone are not makabel tumah. Yet when it comes to this house, they are receiving tumah, and therefore that makes tzaras of the house a chiddush, and therefore we can't learn out, general applications about tzaras from a chiddush. The Rebbe Omar, and says Rebbe, it's true that you actually do need that pasuk of vitziva sabayis Vitziva Kohen Efinu Es Habayis, because the cause of Rachman of Yom Rosbo, because if all the Torah would have written was Rabbi Yehuda's pasuk of that on the day that it's shown to the Kohen, so Avamina the Dvar Mitzvah in the Dvar Arishus Lo, I would think that it's like Rabbi Yehuda says, specifically when it comes to a chosin, when it comes to shalosh regalim, but I wouldn't know that even in a situation where it's completely volitional, I'd be allowed to delay showing it to the Kohen. Because of Rachman of Vitziva Kohen. Therefore, the pasuk says Vitziva Kohen, that you'll command the Kohen, and he says, look, get everything out of the house in advance, to say that even if it's a volitional thing, you could delay showing it to the Kohen. Because of Rachman of Vitziva Kohen, and if all you would have is the pasuk of Vitziva Kohen, Hava Amina Hane in Dilav Tuma Digufe. So I would think that, okay, fine, maybe in the context of Tuma of the house, because it's not actually the tumah of your body, so maybe that's where you could remove these things and delay the decision of the kohen. But when it comes to tumah of the body, I might think that you have to show it to the kohen. Therefore, we have the pasuk of Rabbi Yehuda, of Rabbi Yehuda's pasuk, which is also that it applies to tumah of the body as well. All right. Well, that was daf Zayin of Masechta Moed Katan. The first part of the daf, we learned about different kinds of ways of trapping like rodents and stuff. One way is the normal way, which is you dig a hole and put a trap in there. The other way is you could take a pole, stick it in the ground, and give it a knock, and then it kind of traps all of the rodents that way. All right. Then we talked about filling in a breached wall, fixing a breached wall on Yom Tov. And says on what's it called, on Chol Moed, says Rav Chizda that's specifically in a garden. That in a garden, you can kind of fix it up with palm fronds and things. However, when it comes to a chatzer, when it comes to your courtyard, and you have to worry about people coming and stealing from you, so then you would be allowed to even properly construct the wall on Chol HaMoed. Then we started talking about tzaras, which is a little bit technical, but I guess maybe arguably interesting as well, that we saw machlokas between Reb Meir and Reb Yossi about, do you have a look at tzaras on Yom Tiv or on Chol Moed or not. Reb Meir says, well, yes, you could show it to the Kohen. The Kohen could be lenient, i.e., if it's tahor, he could say it's tahor, but if it's tameh, he would not say that it's tameh. He would just keep his mouth shut. Reb Yossi says, no, do not show it to the Kohen at all, because just like he'll say that if it's tahor, then he also has to say if it's tameh, he has to say that it's tameh. So just do not show it at all. Then we saw two different ways to Rebbe had made a statement, and there was two different ways to understand it. Right, the first way Rebbe said was that we paskin like Reb Meir that we do show it to the Kohen when the fellow's in quarantine, and we paskin like Reb Meir that we do not show it to the Kohen when the fellow is in isolation. The other way is the opposite, that when the fellow is in quarantine, we do not show it, like Reb Yossi, and when he's in quarantine, and when he's in isolation, we do show it like Reb Meir. And the idea being that, so, what we give sort of emphasis to on, right? Would we prefer that the fellow on Yom Tiv be with his wife? Is that what he would prefer? Or do we prefer that he's with the community? And if we put sort of the emphasis, the what's it called? I don't know what the thing is, but preference, whatever it is, we want him to be with his wife, so then we'll prefer to have a situation where he's in isolation, where he could be with his wife, and not when he's in quarantine where he can't be with his wife. And he'd prefer to be with his community, so then we would push for a situation where he's in quarantine, where he can be with his community, but he can't be with his wife, rather than isolation, where he can be with his wife, but not with his community. Okay, fine. And then we also said, sort of along the way, that basically it's up to the Kohen, right? Both Reb Meir and Reb Yossi are in agreement that as long as you don't show it to the Kohen, or as long as the Kohen has not determined that it's tzaras, then it's not officially considered tzaras yet. And we saw basically Reb Yehuda and Rebbe just learned it out from two different psukim, that until you show the Kohen the tzaras to the Kohen, it's not officially tzaras. We saw machlokes between Abaye and Rava, that Abaye says that there's really no nafkamina between Rebbe and Rabbi Yehuda, whereas Rava says that there actually is a nafkamina, which is when it comes to something that's not a mitzvah. That Rava says that Rabbi Yehuda would say that you can sort of defer showing the tzaras to the Kohen only by something that's a mitzvah, for example, a groom, or if it's the shalosh regalim. Whereas according to Rebbe, it doesn't necessarily have to be mitzvah. Whereas we see that even if you want to just make sure that everything in your house doesn't become tamis, so you can remove everything before the Kohen comes and kind of delay it in that way, that would be acceptable, even though it's not the context of a particular mitzvah. Friends, that was Daf Zayin of Masechet Moed Katan. Hope you enjoyed. Peace out.